Cinema is an ever-evolving art form, constantly adapting to the cultural, political, and technological tides of the time. But as new trends emerge, others are left behind, fading into the mist of Hollywood's shifting sensibilities, forgotten, but never truly gone. Today, we're diving into the world of forgotten subgenres of cinema, those distinctive pockets of storytelling that once thrived but have since dwindled, pushed aside by changing tastes or the relentless march of blockbuster culture. But what makes these subgenres so fascinating is how they reflect the eras that they came from, whether it's the gritty realism of Gen X slacker films or the larger-than-life spectacle of sword and sandal epics. They're like time capsules, giving us a glimpse into what audiences once loved and what Hollywood was willing to bet on. Now, for this video, rather than just do one long info dump, I thought it'd be fun to do a little tier list of 10 forgotten subgenres and see where I think that they stack up. So without further ado, you all know how tier lists work, so let's dive in. First up, we have spaghetti westerns. Now, admittedly, I'm somewhat new to the Western genre. I've really only started watching them seriously within the last 2 years or so. But spaghetti westerns were this incredible twist on the classic American Western, but with an Italian flair, literally. These movies were mostly made by Italian filmmakers in the 60s and 70s, and they brought a totally different vibe to the genre. Instead of the clean-cut cowboys and clear good versus evil stories, spaghetti westerns gave us gritty anti-heroes, bleak moral ambiguity, and some of the coolest soundtracks ever thanks to the legendary Ennio Morricone. They were usually filmed in Spain, so their landscapes still screamed Wild West, but with a distinctive European edge. Think dramatic close-ups, standoffs that last forever, and a whole lot of dust. So why don't we see spaghetti westerns anymore? Well, by the mid-70s, audiences were kind of over westerns in general. People were more into modern stories and flashy new blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars. And on top of that, spaghetti westerns got a little overdone. There were so many of them cranking out the same tropes that it became hard to stand out. Plus, times changed, and people started wanting more nuanced takes on the genre. Think Unforgiven in the 90s. And when it comes to the best of the best, you gotta start with Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. I'm talking A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and of course, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Clint Eastwood became a legend as the man with no name. But other big ones in the genre include Once Upon a Time in the West, which is just epic, and Django by Sergio Corbucci, featuring a gunslinger who's dragging around a coffin. These movies left a huge mark on cinema, inspiring people like Quentin Tarantino to this day. So where am I going to put this on our tier list? Well, now might be a good chance to talk about what I'm intending with this tier list. And I think maybe the whole theme should be, how much do I think that these genres should make a comeback? I don't really know how much of a demand there is in 2025 and beyond for the spaghetti western, but I do kind of think that we are lacking some solid western films. There really haven't been that many in the 21st century that are worth noting. Maybe like 3:10 to Yuma, or I don't know. I'm having a hard time thinking of modern westerns from the 21st century that I really think have made a large impact. So maybe that's a good opportunity to put something like this in the B tier. I think that they could make a comeback, and I think that they should be made more, because I think that there's a whole wellspring of stories that could be told, but I don't know. I don't really know that there's a huge demand for them. So I'm going to put them firmly in the B tier. These are really solid movies, really solid artifacts from the time that they came out, but I don't know how much of a demand there is for them to be made today. All right, up next we have paranoid political thrillers. These are exactly what they sound like: intense, edge-of-your-seat movies about shady government conspiracies, hidden agendas, and the little guy caught in the middle of it all. These films really hit their stride in the 70s, a time when public trust in institutions was at an all-time low, thanks to events like Watergate and the Vietnam War. They're moody, they're cynical, and usually filled with shadowy figures, Cold War paranoia, and protagonists who can never trust anyone. If you've ever wanted to feel like the walls are closing in, these movies have got you covered. So why did Hollywood stop making these kinds of thrillers? Well, they were very much a product of their time. The 70s were the perfect storm of political scandals and a growing sense that the people in charge were up to no good. And by the 80s, though, movies seem to have gotten a little bit more optimistic. Think Top Gun. And audiences were looking for heroes to root for, not systems to question. Also, once you've done the evil government cover-up angle so many times, it gets hard to keep it fresh. That said, some of that paranoia has crept back in with modern thrillers, just in a different form. Now, if you're looking for examples of paranoid political thrillers, you've got to start with All the President's Men. It's about the two reporters who uncover the Watergate scandal, and it's just as tense as any action movie. And then there's The Parallax View, which dives into secret assassinations and brainwashing. Then you've got 3 Days of the Condor and Marathon Man, which is, well, let's just say it makes you fear the dentist forever, and also something like The Manchurian Candidate. Now, for some newer examples, we've got things like Argo, Snowden, State of Play, The Courier with Benedict Cumberbatch, The Report with Adam Driver is a great one, The Post, to a certain degree, kind of fits in this category. So it does sort of seem like the paranoid political thriller has not been totally forgotten. It still sort of exists. But I think what I'm missing is a little bit more modern, is a little bit more contemporary, something that speaks to the politics of today, something that seems to be somewhat ignored. So I don't know. I'm thinking that this needs to be here, and it is a genre that I love going back to. I'm going to put this in the B category for now. I don't think it's fully S tier. None of these movies are really my favorites of all time, or movies that I feel incredibly nostalgic about. But I do think that there is a place for them, and I do think that they should be made today. All right, up next we have German Expressionist horror. These films came out of Germany in the 1920s during the silent film era, and they're known for their exaggerated, almost surreal style. Think twisted, angular sets, heavy shadows, and dramatic lighting that make everything feel distorted and creepy. These movies didn't just tell stories, they created moods, often reflecting the anxiety and the chaos of post-World War I Germany. They also laid the foundation for so much of what we now think of as classic horror, with themes of madness, the supernatural, and human vulnerability. Now, why did these films go away? Well, this subgenre faded for a few reasons, but a big one was the rise of sound in cinema, which changed how movies were made and what audiences wanted. German Expressionism thrived on its visuals, and that style didn't really translate as well once dialogue and realism became the focus. Also, many of the filmmakers who pioneered the movement, like F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang, ended up leaving Germany due to political and economic upheaval, especially with the rise of the Nazi regime. Now, the art form didn't disappear entirely. Its influence spread to Hollywood and other genres, especially in film noir and later horror. And when you think of German Expressionist horror, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the crown jewel. Then there's F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, one of the earliest vampire films. And let's not forget about Metropolis by Fritz Lang, which leans more towards sci-fi but has those haunting expressionist visuals. These films might be nearly a century old, but their influence on horror and beyond is absolutely timeless. Now, for some more modern examples, we have things like Edward Scissorhand, or just sort of Tim Burton in general. Think Sleepy Hollow or Sweeney Todd. We also have the Nosferatu remake, which came out last year, which was directed by Robert Eggers, which definitely uses a lot of the German Expressionist influence in its cinematography. Another somewhat recent example I could think of is The Babadook, which has a lot of German Expressionist influence, especially in the design of the Babadook itself. Again, there's influence, but not straight up uses of style, and I'm not sure why that is. And when it comes to my tier list, I'm not the biggest horror fan, and German Expressionist horror doesn't really do it for me all that much. I'm not so sure how much this style needs to make a comeback. I do think that there's novelty to it. I do think it offers a unique flair to the genre, but if this thing were to come back whole hog and every other horror film was going to include these really harsh shadows and dramatic angular sets, I don't really know how much that would hold up, and I think it would get old pretty fast. I'm honestly going to put this in the C tier. I think that this is a fun little artifact of film history, but I don't know that it needs to make a comeback. All right, up next, we are talking about screwball comedies. Screwball comedies are the chaotic, fast-talking, and endlessly charming comedies of the 1930s and 40s. These movies were all about witty banter, zany misunderstandings, and romantic sparks flying between characters who usually started out at each other's throats. They often revolved around themes of class clashes, mistaken identities, or people getting caught up in wild schemes. And let's be real, nobody did snappy dialogue and comedic timing quite like these films. They were the perfect escape during the post-Great Depression era and gave audiences a mix of laugh-out-loud humor and heartfelt romance. So why did these movies go away? By the 1950s, screwball comedies started to lose their shine. Hollywood was shifting toward more polished romantic comedies or lavish musicals, And the rapid-fire dialogue and absurd situations of Screwball felt a little old-fashioned. As tastes evolved, comedy leaned more into broader physical humor and more grounded situational laughs. That said, you could still see Screwball DNA in plenty of modern rom-coms and comedies in general that try to recapture that same spark. Now, if you're looking for Screwball comedies, Bringin' Up Baby is an absolute must-watch with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. Then there's His Girl Friday, where Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell deliver some of the fastest, wittiest dialogue in film history. It Happened One Night is another classic that basically set the template for rom-coms as we know them today. Now, if you're looking for more modern examples, The Hudsucker Proxy by the Coen brothers and Raising Arizona, I think, are some pretty good takes on the Screwball comedy. I Heart Huckabees is kind of a divisive film, but it kind of has this witty, fast-talking Screwball comedy energy to it. The work of Tina Fey, I think, is really, really inspired by Screwball comedies. A Fish Called Wanda feels Screwball to me. Also something like There's Something About Mary. But a lot of the films I'm mentioning here are over 20 years old. So Screwball comedies don't really seem to have much of a place in 2025. And I'm not really sure why that is. I think that they deserve to make a comeback. I think comedy in general, in cinema, is something that really needs to make a comeback. And Screwball comedies might feel old-fashioned, but you know what? There's a place for them. I'm going to put them in the A tier because I kind of miss Screwball comedies. All right, up next, we are talking about sword and sandal epics. Sword and sandal pictures, also known as peplum films, which I learned while doing research for this video, are grand epic movies set in ancient times full of gladiators, kings, gods, and legendary battles. These films were huge in the 1950s and early 60s, giving audiences larger-than-life stories from ancient Rome, Greece, Egypt, and biblical tales. They had massive sets, flowing robes, chiseled heroes, and big dramatic moments. Basically, Hollywood's answer to ancient history, mixed with a dash of myth, spectacle, heroism, and grand storytelling. So why did these epic sword and sandal films fade away? For one, they were expensive to make. Huge sets, thousands of extras, elaborate costumes, and as television became popular, studios got nervous about investing so much in these big-scale historical epics. Plus, audience tastes started shifting toward modern stories and new genres like spaghetti westerns or more contemporary dramas. Eventually, the formula started to feel a bit repetitive, and with the rise of new filmmaking styles, these grandiose epics just weren't in demand. Now, when you think of sword and sandal movies, you can't miss Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, Spartacus, Cleopatra, which is a huge production known as much for its legendary budget overruns as for Elizabeth Taylor's iconic performance. These films were big, bold, and helped define epic cinema for generations, even to this day. Now, to say that sword and sandal epics are totally forgotten would just be incorrect. I mean, just last year we had Gladiator 2, and next year we're going to be getting Christopher Nolan's adaptation of The Odyssey. But it did feel like they went away for a bit before now, so maybe they're just making a comeback. Troy is beloved. Immortals and 300, I guess, would be considered part of this genre. But in between the 1990s and 2025, I think I could probably count on one hand the amount of high-profile sword and sandal pictures that we have gotten. Now, as for the tier list, I don't know how much we really need the sword and sandal epic. I do think that there is a ton of stories that are left to be told, and I think under the right care, with the right filmmakers at the helm, we could get some really, really interesting stuff. This is a bit of a tricky one. I'm not really entirely sure where to put this. Maybe B, but also I kind of think C. I don't really know how much people are itching for these types of epics, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you'll let me know in the comments if you think the sword and sandal movies need to make a comeback. I am going to kind of put them in the C tier, especially when it comes to biblical epics. I do think that that is something that has definitely fallen by the wayside as more and more people are skeptical about religious storytelling in cinema. So I'm going to put this in the C tier. I do think that there are a ton of stories from different eras and different myths that I think could be adapted, but I'm going to put this in the C tier. Up next, we have Blaxploitation movies. Blaxploitation films exploded onto the scene in the early 1970s as a fresh and bold subgenre made by and for Black audiences. These movies were packed with funky soundtracks, street-smart heroes, gritty urban settings, and a mix of action, crime, and sometimes even supernatural elements. They flipped the usual Hollywood script by putting Black characters front and center, often tough, confident, and unapologetically rebellious. Blaxploitation wasn't just entertainment. It was a cultural movement that gave voice to a community rarely seen on screen before. Blaxploitation faded by the late 70s for a couple of reasons. First, the market got flooded with knockoffs that started to feel repetitive and pretty low budget. Also, some critics said that these films sometimes leaned too heavily on stereotypes, which sparked debates over whether they were empowering or harmful. And as Hollywood slowly began to offer more diverse stories and characters outside of the blaxploitation mold, the subgenre just kind of lost its unique edge. But still, its impact on music, style, and cinema culture is pretty undeniable. And you can't talk about blaxploitation without mentioning Shaft, the smooth-talking private detective with an iconic theme song, or Superfly, which brought us the story of a stylish drug dealer trying to get out of the game set to a killer Curtis Mayfield soundtrack. And then there's Foxy Brown, starring Pam Grier as one of the fiercest female leads of the era. These movies had attitude and style, and they became cult classics for good reason. While classic blaxploitation isn't really made anymore, you can definitely see its influence on modern films like Black Panther and Da 5 Bloods. Even Tarantino's Jackie Brown pays homage to the genre, not least of which is because it stars Pam Grier. But yeah, while the subgenre itself might be a bit forgotten, its spirit definitely lives on. Also, check out Black Dynamite if you haven't. I'm curious whether these films would even translate today, short of being parodies in the vein of something like Black Dynamite. Now, admittedly for me, blaxploitation films are not my bread and butter. They're not something that I grew up watching, and I'm not really sure how much they have a place in 2025 outside of maybe parodies of them or just vague influence on cinema. So I am going to put this in the C tier because maybe there's an argument to be made that we need more unique and daring cinema, especially when it comes to Black performers and Black filmmakers. But I don't know how much we need full blaxploitation films to make a comeback in 2025 and beyond. So I'm going to put it in the C tier. Maybe you can convince me otherwise in the comments. Okay, up next we have a fun one. We're talking about beach party movies. Now, beach party films were the ultimate teen escapism in the 1960s. Think sunny beaches, catchy surf rock music, and lots of dancing. These movies were lighthearted romps, usually featuring a group of young friends navigating romance, rivalries, and silly shenanigans, all while soaking up the sun. They weren't trying to be deep, they were just fun, feel-good entertainment, often starring icons like Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon. The vibe was all about carefree youth and good times under the California sun. Beach party films burned bright, but fizzled out by the late 1960s, partly because youth culture was shifting. The counterculture movement and the rise of more serious, socially conscious films made these frothy, bubblegum stories feel a little bit out of touch. Plus, as teen audiences grew up, they started craving more mature and complex narratives. The formula also just got a bit repetitive. There's only so much you can do with sand, surfboards, and romantic mix-ups before it starts to feel like deja vu. But if you want the quintessential beach party experience, you gotta check out Beach Blanket Bingo, probably the most famous of the bunch, or Gidget, or Muscle Beach Party, or How to Stuff a Wild Bikini, or Clam Bake starring Elvis Presley. Now, when it comes to modern beach party movies, I really struggle to find examples that I would even consider beach party movies. There are certainly movies that feature parties on beaches, but none of them really fit into this mold. And there are also summertime teen comedies that I guess follow in this lineage, like Adventureland or recently Snack Shack, but calling them beach party movies really feels like a stretch. I feel like I could be convinced that these movies need to make a comeback. Just teen summer comedies in general, I think, need to be in the mix in the cinematic landscape. In terms of this tier list, when I think of everything else on this list, I do think that this is the least needed category. I'm going to put this in the D tier. I think that these are gone for good reason. And yeah, I don't know. They got to go in the D tier. All right, up next, we're talking about Mumblecore. Mumblecore was this indie film subgenre from the mid-2000s. Some of you might remember it. It had a pretty big moment. It feels like you're eavesdropping on your hipster friends having awkward but deeply personal conversations. These movies had super low budgets, often shot on handheld cameras, with a heavy focus on naturalistic dialogue and improvisation. As for plot, there wasn't much of any. Instead, Mumblecore films were all about characters, usually 20 or 30 somethings, navigating relationships, career woes, and existential crises. They felt like a pretty appropriate successor to the Gen X slacker movies of the 1990s. Now, Mumblecore's DIY vibe was perfect for its time, but as those filmmakers grew up and got bigger budgets, the genre naturally evolved. The aesthetic of Mumblecore didn't really jive with the polished world of streaming platforms and blockbusters, where audiences started expecting high production values even from their indie projects. Plus, the hyper-specific millennial themes didn't always resonate as widely as filmmakers might have hoped, so it became more of a niche interest. That said, Mumblecore didn't totally vanish, it just kind of morphed into something else. Now, the OG Mumblecore film is The Puffy Chair, directed by the Duplass brothers, which set the tone for the whole movement. Then you have films like Hannah Takes the Stairs by Joe Swanberg, which is another big one, featuring Greta Gerwig before she became, well, Greta Gerwig. Other examples might be like Drinking Buddies or Frances Ha. Now, there are plenty of examples of Mumblecore kind of dipping its toe in modern films, like Shiva Baby is a recent example, or there was this movie with Ray Romano. God, I am blanking on the name of it. Hold on, I need to look this up. Oh yeah, there was this movie called Paddleton starring Ray Romano and Mark Duplass that from memory was kind of Mumblecore-ish, but that was also like 2019 or 2018. That was a while ago. So yeah, Mumblecore still kind of has its place, but in terms of the bare bones indie handheld camera, super low budget Mumblecore, I don't really know how much we need this anymore. I like that Mumblecore elements kind of show their face here and there, but I don't really know how much we need straight up Mumblecore anymore. So also with the rise of podcasting, I really kind of feel like podcasts kind of took over the role that Mumblecore was going for. So I'm actually going to put this in the D tier because I think we are kind of inundated with young people talking about their problems in front of a microphone or in front of a camera. Let's move on. All right, up next, we're talking about children on an adventure movies. These movies were all about capturing the magic of youthful curiosity and the thrill of exploration. These films often featured a ragtag group of kids stumbling upon a mystery or a treasure or an alien encounter, leading them to exciting and sometimes dangerous escapades. And what made the subgenre special was its ability to see the world through a child's eyes, filled with wonder, camaraderie, and the belief that anything is possible. At their core, these movies were a celebration of friendship and the boundless imagination of youth. So why did these go away? Well, as family entertainment shifted toward CGI-heavy blockbusters and franchises, the more grounded, heartfelt charm of these films started to feel kind of quaint. Studios prioritized big-budget spectacles over these smaller, intimate stories that children on an adventure films really thrived on. The rise of streaming also meant that kids now have a constant stream of high-quality content at home, making these sort of one-off cinematic adventures feel like less of an event. Plus, let's face it, parents became a little bit more protective in the 2000s, and kids running off unsupervised to battle criminals or explore caves, it doesn't really quite have the same ring in today's world. Now, when it comes to this subgenre, there are a ton of great examples. The Goonies is probably the first movie that comes to mind. Who wouldn't want to join a treasure hunt after watching that movie? But then you have movies like E.T. or Explorers, which is another gem where a group of young boys build their own spacecraft and venture off into the unknown. And I'm just going to rattle off some more movies. We've got The Sandlot, Flight of the Navigator, Little Monsters, Never-Ending Story, The Lost Boys, The Boy Who Could Fly. The list goes on and on. I'll even throw Stand By Me, which isn't totally what I mean by this genre. Usually I think of them as more comedic or having like sci-fi fantasy elements, but I'll throw that in the mix as well. These films definitely defined a generation, defined me for quite a while, giving us a sense of adventure and nostalgia that's really hard to replicate. And thankfully, the spirit of children on an adventure movies hasn't disappeared completely. I mean, Stranger Things alone owes a massive debt to this subgenre. The remake of Pete's Dragon has this magical quality to it. Super 8 is another great one, great recent example, in my opinion. But look at that. I named like a dozen examples off the top of my head from pre-1995, and now I could hardly think of any from the last 10 years that aren't TV examples. I mean, most recently, The Skeleton Crew is another solid TV example that was pitched as Star Wars meets The Goonies. I just wonder why we're infusing things like The Goonies into other IP instead of making the next The Goonies, you know? So for this reason, I'm going to put Children on an Adventure in the S tier. These were my favorite movies growing up, obviously because I was a kid and these things like really got me going, really got me in the mood to watch more cinema. And I don't know, I think we're sadly missing these types of stories in cinema. Sure, we have them in TV form, but where are these movies in the cinema? I beg of you, make more of these. Okay, and last but not least, we are going to talk about mid-budget erotic thrillers. Mid-budget erotic thrillers were these steamy, suspense-filled dramas that dominated screens in the 1980s and 90s. These films often combined crime, mystery, or betrayal with a heavy dose of sensuality, walking the fine line between titillation and psychological intrigue. They were unapologetically stylish and oozed a sultry vibe, often featuring morally ambiguous characters, femme fatales, and stories dripping with sexual tension. It was a genre that dared to blur the boundaries between love, lust, and danger, delivering unforgettable twists in the process. The mid-budget erotic thriller fell victim to a few cultural shifts. The rise of the blockbuster and the dominance of franchises pushed these films out of theaters, as studios prioritized safe, big money projects. At the same time, the arrival of prestige TV and streaming platforms provided a new outlet for stories about sex and relationships, leaving the erotic thriller genre stranded somewhere in this no man's land between being too risque for mainstream cinema and not edgy enough for cable. Also, the changing social climate made some of these films' more problematic tropes feel a little outdated, pushing them further into obscurity. Some iconic titles that define the genre are Basic Instinct, The Last Seduction, Bound, Body Heat, Wild Things, Fatal Attraction, and Secretary, which is a movie that I watched somewhat recently. I guess you could consider it a thriller. It's not really that thrilling, but it's definitely erotic. These films weren't just about sex, though. They were about power, obsession, and the darkest corners of human desire. For some recent examples, I would throw out The Voyeurs. Definitely check out The Voyeurs, especially if you're a fan of Sydney Sweeney. Also, most recently last year, we had Baby Girl, which I think a lot of people were like, oh, this is like a modern erotic thriller for our time. I didn't find it that thrilling. It certainly was erotic. Then we've got the 50 Shades movies, which I haven't seen any of them, so I can't really speak to their quality. We have this movie called Deep Water that starred Ben Affleck and Ana de Armas, which I also didn't see. And speaking of Ben Affleck, we have Gone Girl, which certainly is thrilling, but I don't know how erotic it is. And then maybe something like Love Lies Bleeding is an example. But again, don't really know if it fits the genre. This is something I do think we need more of in mainstream cinema and doesn't need to just be relegated to streaming services or prestige television. I'm gonna sort of put this in the B tier, just because I've heard this argument that Hollywood has become a little desexed in recent times. I don't know how much I really agree with that. I just think that the sex has moved onto a different place and isn't as prominent in cinema. But yeah, I mean, I think that mid-budget erotic thrillers, mid-budget movies in general, I think should make a comeback. But mid-budget erotic thrillers, I think, could possibly make a comeback. But yeah, there we have it. This is my tier list of these 10 forgotten subgenres of cinema. I really don't know how I feel about this entire list right here. I definitely do think that Children on an Adventure need to be here. This was hard to do because in general, I think that we just need more cinema. I think that we need more of these types of stories in general. Like, I would welcome a beach party movie. I would welcome more Mumblecore movies. That's going to do it for me on this video. Let me know what you think of all of these subgenres that I talked about. Where do you think you would kind of stack them in a tier list? Where would you rank them? Which ones do you want to see make a comeback? Also, let me know what other subgenres you think need to make a comeback or that I should talk about in the next tier list video. There's a lot of subgenres, a lot of microgenres that maybe pop up here and there for 5 years, 10 years, and then they kind of just disappear. Let me know. Let me know in the comments and I'll do another one of these tier lists. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out on the channel, and I will see you all next time.